The desert wind carried the scent of sand and diesel fuel as 12 Navy SEALs crouched behind a rocky outcrop in the mountains of Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez checked his watch again, sweat mixing with the dust on his face despite the cool mountain air. They had been waiting for extraction for 6 hours, and the radio had gone silent 3 hours ago. The mission had started like any other high-value target operation. Intelligence reports indicated a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on NATO forces was hiding in a compound deep in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The SEALs had infiltrated under cover of darkness, moving through treacherous terrain that would challenge even the most experienced mountain climbers. Rodriguez's team was known for their precision and efficiency. They had successfully completed over 40 missions without losing a single team member. Today was supposed to be number 41, a routine capture operation that would remove a key enemy leader from the battlefield. The compound sat nestled between two ridge lines, accessible only by a narrow mountain path that switchbacked up the steep slopes. As dawn broke over the mountains, the team had moved into position. The compound appeared quiet, almost too quiet for a location housing such an important target. Rodriguez felt the familiar knot in his stomach that came with years of combat experience, an instinct that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. The initial breach went smoothly. The team moved through the compound like shadows, clearing room after room with practiced efficiency. They found evidence of recent occupation, but no sign of their target or any other occupants. It wasn't until they reached the main building that everything went wrong. The explosion came from nowhere, a massive blast that shook the entire compound and sent debris flying in all directions. The building they had just exited erupted in flames, and suddenly the quiet morning air filled with the crack of rifle fire from multiple directions. The Taliban had been waiting, and the SEALs had walked directly into a carefully planned ambush. Rodriguez immediately began coordinating his team's response, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. They were surrounded on 3 sides with enemy fighters positioned on the high ground above them. The 4th side offered the only escape route, but it led directly toward a sheer cliff face with no viable extraction point. As bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them, Rodriguez called for immediate air support and emergency extraction. The voice that answered was calm and professional, confirming that help was on the way. But in the mountains of Afghanistan, even the fastest response could take precious time that the SEALs might not have. The enemy fire intensified, and Rodriguez realized they were facing a much larger force than intelligence had indicated. This wasn't just a few Taliban fighters. This was a coordinated operation involving dozens of well-positioned combatants. Someone had leaked information about their mission, and now 12 of America's elite warriors were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. With limited ammunition and no clear escape route, Rodriguez made the difficult decision to establish a defensive perimeter and wait for air support. He had no way of knowing that their salvation would come from an unexpected source, piloted by someone who would risk everything to bring them home safely. Captain Sarah Mitchell was conducting routine patrol flights over the Afghan mountains when the emergency call crackled through her headset. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, responded to her gentle touch on the controls as she banked toward the coordinates being transmitted from the ground. Flying the A-10 required a special kind of pilot. The aircraft was built around its massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a 7-barrel rotary gun capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 4,200 rounds per minute. It wasn't the fastest or most glamorous aircraft in the Air Force fleet, but it was designed for one purpose: providing close air support to troops in contact with enemy forces. Mitchell had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but something about this emergency call felt different. The voice on the radio carried an urgency she hadn't heard before, and the tactical situation described by the forward air controller painted a grim picture. 12 SEALs were surrounded and taking heavy casualties with no viable escape route. Back on the ground, Rodriguez's team was fighting for every second of survival. The enemy had moved closer under cover of sustained fire, and the SEALs were rapidly running low on ammunition. 2 team members had already been wounded, including their medic, leaving Rodriguez to coordinate both the defensive position and medical treatment for his injured men. The Taliban fighters showed remarkable coordination and discipline, suggesting they had received training beyond what local insurgents typically possessed. They moved in small teams using suppressing fire to cover advances while other groups repositioned to eliminate any potential escape routes. Rodriguez realized they were facing foreign fighters, possibly from Pakistan or other neighboring countries. Petty Officer First Class Jackson Williams, the team's communications specialist, worked frantically to maintain contact with their headquarters while simultaneously engaging enemy targets. The radio equipment had been damaged in the initial explosion, and he was running diagnostics while bullets whined overhead. Every few minutes he managed to establish brief contact with their command center, providing updates on their deteriorating situation. The morning sun climbed higher, making the SEALs' position increasingly untenable. The rocks that provided cover from direct fire offered no protection from the scorching heat, and several team members were already showing signs of dehydration. Their water supplies were limited, and the stress of combat was accelerating fluid loss. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to attempt a breakout toward the cliff face, hoping to find a position that could be more easily defended until air support arrived. The move would require crossing 30 meters of open ground under direct enemy observation, but remaining in their current location meant certain death or capture. As the team prepared for their desperate dash, the sound of automatic weapons fire intensified from all directions. The Taliban had apparently called in reinforcements, and Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from positions that hadn't been active earlier in the fight. Time was running out, and their ammunition wouldn't last much longer. The first SEAL made his move across the open ground, sprinting in a zigzag pattern while his teammates provided covering fire. He made it halfway before a burst of machine gun fire forced him to dive behind a small boulder, pinning him down with no way to advance or retreat. Two more team members were now separated from the main group, with enemy fighters moving to surround their new position. Rodriguez knew they needed air support immediately, or the mission would end in catastrophe. He had no way of knowing that help was already racing toward their position at maximum speed, piloted by someone who would risk everything to ensure no American warrior was left behind on that remote mountainside. Captain Mitchell pushed her A-10 beyond normal operational limits, the twin turbofan engines screaming as she descended toward the mountainous terrain at maximum speed. The coordinates placed the embattled SEALs in some of the most challenging flying conditions possible, with peaks rising over 15,000 feet and unpredictable wind patterns that could slam an aircraft into the mountainside without warning. Through her headset, Mitchell could hear the increasingly desperate radio transmissions from the ground. The forward air controller's voice remained professional, but she could detect the strain as he reported multiple casualties and dwindling ammunition. Between the tactical updates, she caught fragments of gunfire and explosions that painted a vivid picture of the fierce battle taking place below. The A-10's heads-up display showed her approach vector, but Mitchell knew that textbook procedures wouldn't work in these mountains. She would need to come in low and fast, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The element of surprise might be the only advantage the surrounded SEALs had left. On the ground, Rodriguez's situation had become desperate. The Taliban fighters had advanced to within 50 meters of their position, close enough that the SEALs could hear shouted commands in multiple languages. The enemy was coordinating a final assault, and Rodriguez knew his team couldn't repel a determined attack with their remaining ammunition. Corporal David Chen, the team's youngest member on his first deployment, had taken shrapnel in his shoulder but continued returning fire despite his wounds. His position at the eastern edge of their perimeter was taking the heaviest pressure, with enemy fighters attempting to flank their defensive line. Chen's rifle was down to his last magazine, and he could see Taliban fighters moving between the rocks, preparing for a coordinated rush. The radio crackled to life with a new voice. Calm and confident despite the chaos surrounding the transmission, Captain Mitchell identified herself as inbound for immediate close air support, requesting smoke marking of friendly positions. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope as he grabbed a smoke grenade, but he also knew that air support in these mountains was extremely dangerous for both the aircraft and the troops on the ground. Mitchell studied her tactical display as she approached the target area, noting the steep ridge lines that would funnel her attack approach into a narrow corridor. She would have one chance to make her attack run count before the enemy could adjust their positions or bring anti-aircraft weapons to bear. The A-10 was built to survive ground fire, But even the heavily armored Warthog had its limits. The mountains rose around Mitchell's aircraft like ancient guardians, their peaks shrouded in morning mist that would provide both concealment and hazard during her attack run. She could see the valley where the firefight was taking place, marked by rising smoke and the occasional muzzle flash from the ongoing battle below. Rodriguez popped the smoke grenade and watched yellow smoke billow across their position, marking their location for the incoming air support. The bright marker would help the pilot distinguish friendly forces from enemy positions, but it would also draw more enemy fire toward their already precarious defensive line. The Taliban fighters seemed to sense that air support was imminent. Their rate of fire increased dramatically, and Rodriguez could see several groups attempting to withdraw to covered positions among the rocks and caves that dotted the mountainside. Others continued their advance, apparently determined to overrun the SEAL position before American air power could intervene. Mitchell made her final approach adjustments, lining up for an attack run that would take her directly over the enemy positions at an altitude that would leave no room for error. She could see the yellow smoke, marking the friendly forces, and began identifying target clusters among the rocky terrain where enemy muzzle flashes revealed their positions. The young SEAL at the due eastern perimeter fired his last rounds and reached for his sidearm as Taliban fighters closed to within 30 meters of his position. Rodriguez knew they had perhaps minutes left before their defensive line would be overwhelmed. Everything now depended on the pilot racing toward them through the dangerous mountain terrain, someone they had never met, but who represented their only hope for survival. The distinctive roar of the A-10's engines echoed off the canyon walls as Mitchell dropped below the ridgeline, using the natural terrain to conceal her approach until the final moment. The aircraft's titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit was designed to protect pilots from ground fire, but flying this low in mountainous terrain left no margin for error. Mitchell's eyes swept across her instruments while simultaneously scanning the terrain ahead for the telltale signs of enemy positions. Years of combat experience had taught her to read the battlefield like a book, identifying fighting positions. From the patterns of muzzle flashes and movement among the rocks below, the radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice, providing final target coordinates as enemy fighters prepared for what appeared to be their final assault on the SEAL position. Mitchell could see the yellow smoke marking friendly forces, a bright beacon, in the otherwise drab landscape of rock and scrub vegetation that covered the mountainside. Below, Rodriguez watched his ammunition counter drop to single digits as he engaged targets that seemed to multiply faster than he could eliminate them. The Taliban had committed significant resources to this ambush, suggesting their target had been more valuable than intelligence reports indicated. Now 12 American warriors were paying the price for that intelligence failure. Chen pressed his back against a large boulder, his wounded shoulder making it difficult to maintain proper firing position. Through gaps in the rocks, he could see enemy fighters advancing in small groups using covering fire and tactical movement that demonstrated professional military training. These weren't local farmers with rifles. These were experienced combatants who understood modern warfare. The sound of jet engines grew louder, reverberating through the valley with a deep rumble that seemed to shake the mountain itself. Mitchell's A-10 appeared suddenly over the eastern ridge, its distinctive profile unmistakable as it screamed toward the battlefield at low altitude. Taliban fighters scattered for cover as the Warthog passed overhead, but Mitchell was already lining up for her attack run. The GAU-8 cannon beneath her aircraft contained enough firepower to destroy armored vehicles, and against infantry positions among the rocks it would be devastatingly effective. Mitchell rolled into her attack approach, the aircraft responding smoothly to her inputs despite the challenging flying conditions. Wind patterns in the mountains were unpredictable, and she had to constantly adjust for turbulence and downdrafts that could slam her aircraft into the rocky terrain below. The first burst from the GAU-8 cannon sent a stream of depleted uranium rounds into the mountainside, where Mitchell had identified the heaviest concentration of enemy positions. The distinctive sound of the cannon, like a giant chainsaw ripping through metal, dominated the battlefield as 30-millimeter rounds pulverized rock and everything behind it. Rodriguez felt the ground shake under the impact of the cannon fire, and suddenly the enemy fire that had been steadily increasing throughout the morning began to slacken. Mitchell's first pass had disrupted the Taliban's coordinated assault, giving the SEALs their first breathing space in hours. But the respite was temporary. Mitchell could see enemy fighters regrouping in positions that her initial attack run hadn't reached. The mountainous terrain provided numerous caves and rock formations that offered protection from air attack, and the Taliban were taking full advantage of the natural cover. Mitchell pulled into a climbing turn, preparing for another attack run while scanning for additional targets. The narrow valley limited her maneuvering options, and she knew that subsequent passes would be increasingly dangerous as enemy fighters adjusted to her tactics and potentially brought anti-aircraft weapons into play. On the ground, Rodriguez coordinated his team's movement to take advantage of the temporary lull in enemy fire. Several SEALs advanced to better positions, while others provided covering fire, trying to establish a defensive line that could hold until extraction became possible. The radio crackled with Mitchell's voice, calm and professional despite the intense combat situation. She was requesting updated target information and confirming the locations of friendly forces before beginning her second attack run. Rodriguez realized that this pilot was willing to make multiple passes in extremely dangerous conditions to ensure his team's survival. As Mitchell lined up for another approach, she could see that the enemy forces were larger than initial reports had indicated. This wasn't just a small Taliban unit. This was a significant force that had been planning this ambush for some time. The SEALs were facing overwhelming odds, and their survival depended entirely on her ability to break the enemy's attack before her aircraft was damaged or forced to withdraw. Mitchell banked her A-10 into a tight circle above the valley, studying the battlefield below while maintaining enough altitude to avoid small arms fire. She could see enemy fighters repositioning themselves in the caves and rock formations that dotted the mountainside, preparing for her next attack run. The tactical situation required precision that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. Mitchell would need to thread her attack run between the mountain peaks while delivering accurate fire, close enough to enemy positions to be effective, but far enough from the surrounded SEALs to avoid friendly fire casualties. Rodriguez coordinated his team's defensive adjustments during the brief lull in enemy fire. Two of his wounded teammates were still able to fight, but their medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and one man was losing significant blood from a shrapnel wound to his leg. Time was working against them in multiple ways. The Taliban fighters demonstrated their experience by quickly adapting to the air threat. Instead of remaining in large groups that presented attractive targets for the A-10's cannon, they dispersed into smaller teams positioned in natural rock formations that provided overhead cover. Chen used the temporary respite to change positions, moving to a spot that offered better fields of fire, while providing some protection from the aircraft overhead. His wounded shoulder made movement painful, but years of training had prepared him to function, despite injury and exhaustion. Mitchell identified several priority targets for her second attack run, focusing on enemy positions that posed the greatest immediate threat to the surrounded SEALs. She would need to approach from a different angle to surprise the enemy fighters who were now expecting air attack. The A-10's robust construction and redundant systems were designed specifically for this type of close air support mission. Unlike faster fighter aircraft, the Warthog could loiter over the battlefield and make multiple attack passes while absorbing significant ground fire and continuing to operate. Rodriguez watched through binoculars as Mitchell's aircraft disappeared behind the western ridge, preparing for another attack approach. The sound of enemy movement among the rocks suggested the Taliban were using the lull to advance their positions, possibly preparing for a coordinated assault once the aircraft departed. Williams finally managed to establish solid radio contact with their headquarters, providing a detailed situation report that painted a grim picture of their tactical position. Extraction would be impossible until the enemy forces were neutralized or significantly degraded, leaving the SEALs dependent on continued air support. Mitchell's second approach came from an unexpected direction, using a narrow canyon to mask her attack until the final moments. The element of surprise was crucial, as enemy fighters had positioned themselves to engage her previous attack route. The A-10 emerged from behind a rocky outcrop at extremely low altitude, giving Mitchell only seconds to identify targets and engage before terrain forced her to climb away from the mountainside. Her cannon fire walked across a line of enemy positions, each 30mm round delivering devastating kinetic energy that turned rock formations into deadly fragments. Several Taliban fighters attempted to engage the aircraft with small arms fire, but the A-10's armor plating deflected the rifle rounds while Mitchell maintained her attack run. The aircraft's survivability in hostile environments was legendary among ground troops who had witnessed its ability to absorb damage and continue fighting. The second attack run disrupted another enemy assault, but Mitchell could see that significant numbers of fighters remained in positions that her cannon couldn't effectively engage. The mountainous terrain provided natural fortifications that would require ground forces or precision-guided weapons to eliminate. Rodriguez realized that while the air support was keeping his team alive, their situation remained critical. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, medical supplies were gone, and extraction remained impossible until enemy forces were cleared from the surrounding high ground. Mitchell climbed away from the valley floor, assessing her remaining ammunition and fuel while scanning for additional targets. Each attack run consumed precious resources, and she would need to balance aggressive support for the ground forces with aircraft survivability for continued operations. The Taliban fighters showed remarkable resilience, regrouping after each air attack and continuing their attempts to advance on the SEAL positions. Their persistence suggested this operation held significant importance for their leadership, making it unlikely they would withdraw without achieving their objectives. As Mitchell prepared for a third attack run, she could see enemy reinforcements moving along the mountain trails toward the battlefield. The situation was escalating beyond a simple ambush into a major engagement that would require additional air support and immediate extraction planning for the surrounded SEALs. Mitchell's fuel gauge showed she had enough for perhaps 2 more attack runs before being forced to return to base, but she could see that enemy reinforcements were arriving faster than she could eliminate the existing threats. The Taliban had committed significant resources to this operation, and breaking their siege would require maximum aggression and precision. Rodriguez counted his remaining ammunition and realized each team member had less than 1 magazine left. The wounded were growing weaker, and the intense heat was taking its toll on everyone. Without immediate relief, they would be forced to surrender or fight to the last round. The radio crackled with transmissions from their headquarters, confirming that additional air support was en route but still 30 minutes away. Mitchell's A-10 was the only asset currently available to prevent the SEAL position from being overrun in the next critical minutes. Chen noticed enemy fighters moving through a narrow ravine that would bring them within grenade range of the SEAL position. He had no ammunition left for his rifle and was down to his sidearm and 2 fragmentation grenades. The approaching Taliban fighters were using the natural terrain to mask their advance from air observation. Mitchell identified the new threat and realized she would need to make an extremely low-altitude attack run to engage targets in the narrow ravine. The approach would require flying between 2 mountain peaks with minimal clearance, leaving no room for navigation error or wind shifts. Williams established contact with the incoming air support, providing tactical updates and coordinate information that would allow seamless handover once Mitchell's aircraft was forced to depart. The additional aircraft included both fighters and helicopter gunships that could provide sustained fire support. The Taliban forces made their final coordinated assault as Mitchell lined up for her most dangerous attack run yet. Enemy fighters advanced from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the SEALs to engage targets on 3 sides while conserving their last ammunition for the closest threats. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to call for danger, close air support, requesting Mitchell engage targets within 50 meters of friendly positions. The risk of friendly fire casualties was significant, but without immediate intervention, the position would be overrun within minutes. Mitchell acknowledged the danger close request and began her final approach through the narrow mountain corridor. The A-10's wings barely cleared the rocky outcrops on either side as she descended toward the battlefield at an altitude that left no margin for error. The cannon fire from Mitchell's final attack run swept across the advancing enemy forces with devastating effect. The 30-millimeter rounds shattered rock formations and eliminated multiple fighting positions, breaking the momentum of the Taliban assault just meters from the SEAL perimeter. Several enemy fighters broke and began withdrawing toward the mountain trails, apparently deciding the cost of continuing the assault had become too high. Mitchell's sustained attacks had finally tipped the tactical balance in favor of the surrounded American forces. Rodriguez felt a surge of relief as enemy fire slackened dramatically across their entire perimeter. For the first time in hours, his team wasn't taking concentrated fire from multiple directions. Mitchell's courage and skill had bought them precious time and possibly saved their lives. The sound of additional aircraft engines echoed through the valley as the promised reinforcements arrived on station. Mitchell coordinated handover procedures with the incoming pilots while maintaining overwatch of the battlefield to ensure enemy forces didn't reorganize for another assault. Chen was able to move from his defensive position to help treat the wounded team members, using supplies scavenged from their packs to provide basic medical care until proper evacuation could be arranged. The immediate threat had passed, but several SEALs required urgent medical attention. Mitchell began her climb away from the valley, her fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels that required immediate return to base. She had expended nearly all her ammunition and pushed her aircraft beyond normal operational limits to provide the sustained fire support that broke the enemy siege. Rodriguez established radio contact with Mitchell as she departed the battlefield, expressing gratitude for her actions while coordinating with the newly arrived air support for extraction procedures. The rescue helicopters were already en route to their position. As Mitchell's A-10 disappeared over the eastern ridge, Rodriguez realized that 12 American warriors owed their lives to a pilot they had never met, who risked everything to ensure no one was left behind. The mission had failed to capture its original target, but every member of his team would return home because of one pilot's courage and skill in the most challenging flying conditions possible. The rescue helicopters arrived 20 minutes after Mitchell departed, their door gunners scanning the mountainside for any remaining enemy threats. The additional air support had maintained overwatch of the area, ensuring the Taliban forces continued their withdrawal rather than attempting to regroup for another assault. Rodriguez coordinated the evacuation of his wounded teammates first, watching as the helicopter medics immediately began advanced trauma care during the short flight to the nearest forward operating base. Chen's shoulder wound required surgery, but he would make a full recovery and return to active duty within 3 months. Mitchell's A-10 limped back to base on fumes, her aircraft showing multiple impacts from small arms fire that had been absorbed by the titanium armor surrounding the cockpit. Ground crews would later count 17 bullet strikes on the aircraft, none of which had penetrated critical systems or flight controls. The intelligence failure that led to the ambush became the subject of extensive investigation. The Taliban had apparently received advance warning of the mission through a network of informants that intelligence agencies hadn't detected. The original target had escaped hours before the SEALs arrived at the compound. Rodriguez and his team spent 3 days at the forward operating base, undergoing medical evaluation and mission debriefing. Every member of the team survived, though 2 required extended medical treatment for their wounds. The mission was classified as a tactical failure, but operational success due to the successful extraction of all personnel. Mitchell returned to flight operations the following day, her aircraft repaired and rearmed for continued close air support missions. She never spoke publicly about the mission, considering it simply part of her duty as an Air Force pilot, supporting ground forces in hostile territory. 3 weeks later, Rodriguez received orders transferring him back to the United States for advanced training and a brief leave period with his family. Before departing Afghanistan, he made a special request through military channels to meet the A-10 pilot who had saved his team. The meeting took place at Bagram Airfield, where Mitchell was temporarily stationed between missions. Rodriguez and his team members who were still in country gathered on the flight line next to Mitchell's aircraft, the same A-10 that had broken the enemy siege in the mountains. Mitchell was surprised by the formal ceremony that Rodriguez had arranged, presenting her with a team patch and a letter signed by all 12 SEALs expressing their gratitude for her actions. She had flown hundreds of combat missions, but this was the first time she had met the ground forces she had supported. The conversation between warriors from different services revealed the mutual respect that bonds military personnel who risk their lives for their teammates. Mitchell learned about the individual SEALs she had helped save, while Rodriguez gained insight into the challenges facing pilots who provide close air support in mountainous terrain. Chen, his arm still in a sling from his shoulder surgery, presented Mitchell with a photograph taken during their mission debriefing, showing all 12 team members together. On the back they had written a simple message thanking her for bringing them home when hope seemed lost. The official after-action report credited Mitchell's actions with preventing the loss of an entire SEAL team and recommended her for appropriate recognition. Her sustained attack runs under extremely dangerous conditions had demonstrated the highest traditions of military service and personal courage. Rodriguez returned to his family in San Diego, carrying with him the knowledge that American warriors in different uniforms had risked everything to ensure he could walk through his front door again. The mission in the Afghan mountains had failed its original objectives, but it had reinforced the bonds that unite military personnel across service boundaries. Mitchell continued flying combat missions until her deployment ended 6 months later. She returned to the United States for advanced training as an instructor pilot, where she would teach the next generation of A-10 pilots the skills needed to support ground forces in hostile environments. Years later, Rodriguez and Mitchell maintained contact through military networks, their lives connected by a few critical minutes over a remote mountainside, where courage and skill had overcome overwhelming odds. The SEALs had given up hope until her A-10 Thunderbolt roared over the ridge in fire and fury, proving that no American warrior fights alone when others have the power to help.